Welcome to Opposing Views, a hard, straightforward discussion of today's most pressing issues. A single tweet of a celebrity triggered serious discussions about informal settlers, but more than the noise it has created, it raises a valid question. By giving 18,000 pesos to each family, is the government going overboard in assisting informal settlers? Good evening, I'm Rod Nepomuceno, and this is Opposing Views. The Aquino government has started to disperse informal settlers out of their shanties. A show of force that it is taking its plan seriously to remove these households living in the danger zones and whose lots are already acquired by private entities. The National Statistics Office defines informal settlers as households occupying a lot rent-free without the consent of the owner. To date, the Asian Development Bank recorded over 3.4 million or 35% of Metro Manila's population living in informal settlements, and this number is growing every single day. Under different presidencies, numerous policies were tried but failed to address the influx of informal settlers.
Para po solusyonan ito, nakikipag-ugnayan tayo sa mga LGU upang maayos na mailipat ang mga informal settlers.
The government's relocation plan includes an 18,000 peso subsidy to be given in staggered basis to subsidize their needs, while officials are looking for their permanent dwelling. However, some urban poor groups believe that the government's move is not enough. Despite negotiations, most informal settlers refuse to leave what they call home. Joining us tonight in our discussion about informal settlers is Kabataan Party List Representative Attorney Terry Ridon. Good evening, Attorney Terry. Your thoughts on informal settlers?
The government should take care of the informal settlers. Subsidies ought to be given with respect to the informal settlers.
All right. And with us also is a business journalist and publisher of Business Insight, Mr. Amado Jake Makasayat. Sir, your thoughts on informal settlers?
I don't like it. It has to be qualified. There are better forms of subsidies that will make their lives, that provides them a life a little better to live. But putting cash in his pocket is something I do not think I want to share.
All right, so we have two opposing views here. One is for government subsidy, Congressman Terry, and Mr. Jake, your position is no subsidy. Congressman Terry, can you expound further your position on providing subsidy? Government should be providing subsidies for informal settlers.
I think the informal settlers is a situation which the informal settlers never wanted. Mm-hmm. No? But I think the subsidies which is being proposed by government, the 18,000 subsidies, it is something that is not needed. A different form of subsidy ought to be given to the informal settlers. Instead of them being given cash, they ought to be given better homes, schools, jobs, education, healthcare, among others, and not the cash which is being peddled by government, similar to the conditional cash transfer which government wants to give the poorest of our people, included. Which is why I'm saying government needs to subsidize, but not in the form of the cash subsidies that
so your position, the government, it is a responsibility of government to help these informal settlers and by providing them with subsidies, not necessarily the subsidies that they plan to give, as I understand it. So in your case, you're a little bit hardline when it comes to no subsidies because you feel that they should be
for us. The problem with subsidy in this country is it is given to the consumers. Mm-hmm. You don't increase productivity by subsidizing the consumers. You subsidize the producers. If you give the subsidy to the producer, he becomes a net producer. Mm-hmm. If you give it to the consumer, he becomes a net consumer. Mm-hmm. So what? Taxpayers' money goes to waste. Mm-hmm. And the responsibility to provide subsidies is self-imposed. By and large, is calculated for political gains. There are other ways of helping them than putting money in their pockets. Because who is going to check whether this money is going to be used for the purpose intended? For all you know, he's going to use most of it to buy a bottle of gin or some other drink. For all you know, he'll play mahjong or go to the sabong. We never know. The number is too large to be checked.
All right. Now there seems to be a clash of class. No, we have of course the middle class who are sometimes whining and complaining about informal settlers. In fact, blaming them and all that. No, and the middle class seems to be saying that the government is babying these informal settlers. Your take on that, Congressman?
That comes from a position that is ignorant and comes from a position that is with great class prejudice against the poor. No? I think the urban poor has never been babied by government. In fact, the urban poor has never been provided adequate jobs, adequate livelihood by government. And when even during the floods, they're the ones being blamed by government as the cause of the floods, when in fact they just have light materials in their homes.
So that sometimes they're the ones.
Yeah. So I
bear
think
the
the babying aspect is something that is incorrect.
Yeah.
It comes from.
You think that we're babying them, Jake, if we are providing them with subsidies?
I don't exactly know what you mean by babying, but what I
Maybe spoiling them, or
yes, I agree that we're spoiling
to
them.
what extent do you think the government is responsible in helping out the informal settlers? And then we'll get to you, Jake, in a while.
No,
Congressman, to what extent?
I think it doesn't have to be just the informal settlers, but the entire country actually. It should be a cradle to grave even, taking care. Our government should be taking care of our informal settlers and most of our people from cradle to grave. So it's not just about providing cash subsidies, but provide free education, accessible education, free health care, livelihood to them. I think all of these things ought to be provided by government.
It should improve his life. Like I said, health care. How much money
Yeah, how much?
went to waste instead of going to the PGH? Pork barrel. Part of it goes to the pocket of the lawmakers, with all due respect to you.
Oh, that's a whole topic
Congressman.
altogether.
Huh?
All right. Yeah. But let's think.
Subsidy yan eh.
Okay.
Politics din ang ano yan.
All right.
Oh.
But do you feel though, to what extent do you think the government, like we were talking about informal settlers, do you think the government should provide the homes for informal settlers, or do you think not fully that they should work for it?
As much as it can. After all, the National Housing Authority, that's the name for it, still has plenty of idle land. And you put them there, give them homes. But if you do not give them jobs, they become they cease to be informal settlers, only in the sense that they have a home, but there's no food in the stomach. So, what sense will they do if, as he says, you don't give them opportunities to have jobs? And I thought I earlier said that the educational system is probably slightly wrong.
All right. Jake, at this point now, we'd like to take a look at our online polls. Now, our question is, by giving 18,000 pesos to each family, is the government going overboard in assisting the informal settlers? Now, the results are yes, 67%, meaning they are going overboard, the government is going overboard, and 33% no. Now, to join the discussion, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/solaropposingviews, and then follow us on Twitter at @opposingviews and use the hashtag #opposingviews. We'll take a short break, more on the issue of informal settlers when Opposing Views returns. Welcome back. You're still watching Opposing Views. Still with us, Attorney Terry Ridon of Kabataan Party List and Mr. Amado Jake Makasayat, the publisher of Business Insight. And we're still discussing the government, if the government has the responsibility to subsidize informal settlers. Now, there's this amount, no, 18,000 pesos, because I think that what they did is they computed the 50 billion that's allotted for the relocation of these informal settlers, and then divided it among the number of households or families. No? Now, at least in your position, because the Lina law does provide for the government, and it's the government's responsibility to relocate these informal settlers. Do you think this 18,000 pesos does the job? Is this the compliance of the government insofar as the Lina law is concerned?
Well, I think the 18,000 is a ruse, an excuse for government to go around the Lina law. I think by the time that the urban poor settler receives the 18,000 pesos, government would be
You
excused.
will never know how the 18,000 will be spent. Definitely, it will not increase his productivity. And the worst part is, you know, as subsidy goes on and the amount is raised, it develops a higher dependence among those people on the state. We should all work very hard. The government's duty is to give us peace, make us secure in our homes. And then, given a situation like that, we will not have fear of being pickpocketed or our farms, the produce, the harvest will be stolen.
Do you think, now let me ask you about, probably not really grading the government, no, but do you think the government is at least going towards the right direction when it comes to handling informal settlers? Do you think the government is in the right track?
Well, government has been demolishing the homes.
So you think that's not...
So that's like
not,
an F.
Yeah, that's
That's
an F.
like a 5. Yeah. Instead of government really understanding the plight of the urban poor, they just want the problem to go away.
Yeah.
It's like just like
It's like a
Imelda
Band-Aid solution.
putting walls on the esteros to remove the urban poor settlers from sight.
But would you agree?
along
Would you
highways.
agree with the argument, though, that if you don't do it this way, they're never going to leave?
Well, I think the problem really is, with respect to the estero dwellers, which they want to remove from their homes, actually, because this is the one that they really are focusing at the moment. They're not the cause of the floods. There had been a study in 2006 for the cause of the floods. First, by a UP study. First would be the massive groundwater extraction, which led to subsidence. The land is going really further down. Number two would be the formal developments along the path of the river. Well, I think, of course, they're there along the esteros, but these are made of light materials, and it cannot be made really the cause of the floods.
I see.
So I think government is proceeding from an invalid assumption.
But why did we come to this point? Because the government failed and continues to fail to provide opportunities for its people. And as they multiply, I'm telling you, the situation it's going to get worse before it gets better.
But do you agree? So you're saying that you're in favor of the demolition?
Well, in a way, yes.
Yes.
You know, I told you the story about why should the piece of land that I acquired with blood and sweat be occupied by squatters I cannot drive out?
Right.
I mean, I'm not a violent man.
Yeah. But you agree with the
If
demolition?
I lose,
Yeah.
if I lose my sanity, I might be bound to shoot.
No.
I think there needs to be a distinction between the government lands being occupied by the informal settlers and private lands.
Private lands,
Yeah.
right.
Yes, correct.
I think in the Lina law, the private owners can really subject his or her areas to demolition proceedings because that's his property.
That's a good point.
But I think most of the demolitions occurring around the Metro Manila area are mostly government lands. And I think, which is why I think many of the urban poor settlers are really protesting because they want to remove them from government lands, but government doesn't really want to provide relocation for them. And under the Lina law, it is the state's obligation to provide relocation for them because it's in recognition of the fact that the urban poor situation is not really because of them alone.
Do you think that the Lina law is sufficient in addressing this issue or not? Your take?
I think despite the Lina law, the professional squatters are still there, using legitimate urban poor groups. And I think it is obviously the state's government still to really pounce upon the professional squatters. But I think the response ought not to be to demolish the entire squatter area.
But I think the law is stupid. What does it encourage? Squatting. As I said, I work with blood and tear for a piece of land, and then I cannot even drive them out. And it stifles productivity. And there's a piece of land that I can use to build some apartments, and maybe in the process of building, some carpenters find temporary jobs. I get a little income, rental income from. How can I be denied the fruits of my own labor for the benefit of the squatters? That's not fair. The problem is, I think, we pampered the poor. As I said, we develop in their minds a higher dependence on the state. And with all due respect, the congressman here, the politicians are responsible for it. You know, they promised the moon. After they get elected, everything is forgotten. They got pork barrel. There is the barrel, yes, but the pork goes into the pocket.
Now, all right, you
Where
mentioned
are we going?
You mentioned the Lina law is pampering the poor. Do you agree? The Lina law is pampering the poor?
Well, the Lina law has been the cause of the demolitions, actually. That has been, that law is being used by government to, we have the Lina law here, and this is the order.
Exactly.
To remove you from the homes. And despite the Lina law, you still see the cries of the urban poor. They still don't have homes. They still don't have adequate relocation. They still don't have jobs.
Let's assume one thing. Let's say you do have the political and economic power to address this issue of informal settlers. Mr. Jake, I'll ask you first. If you had the political and economic power to address this, what would you do? What would you enact?
The problem with your question is the big if.
All right. Now, assuming.
If I had the power,
Yes. What would you do? What
to
specifically?
deal with the squatters?
To deal with
the informal settlers,
yes.
I will force them
So force.
with the use of
With force.
police authority.
To go away.
I said there are millions of hectares of state land. I'll settle them there. This is where I will not agree to subsidy. In the initial years, while they're waiting for the maize or corn to ripen, be harvested in the rice field, and they come out to come out, give them a little money so they'll survive. But in the end, if they are carefully assisted, can you imagine the additional productivity this country will have? We might even stop importing rice. And who did this for us? The informal settlers. And how did they do it? We gave them the opportunity to help themselves and their country. Pero kung bibigyan mo yan ng 18 pesos, baka he'll use it at the mahjong table.
In your case, what
We'll probably won't be demolishing them anytime soon. But we will have a preference for in-city relocation.
In-city relocation.
Yeah, we'd rather have them here to provide services to maybe to the business districts or to provide service to bee workers near the factories. And instead of bringing them somewhere else where they don't have jobs, where they don't have lands, where they don't have health care, where they don't have schools.
They don't have access to transportation.
Yeah, and that's precisely the problem. And for example, in the growing district in Taguig, business district in Taguig, there is a new settlement already being built because it is precisely the nature of growing business districts for a need of service personnel.
Right.
And these service personnel aren't really exactly those who live in the condos, right?
Right.
So, and they're the ones who really need to live near their places of work, but need a place to stay cheaply.
So your position is opposed to Jake. You don't use force in demolishing their homes, but provide them first with in-house
in-city
in-city
relocation.
All right. Very interesting discussion. Now, Folks, let's be optimistic about this. Poor people are not doomed to failure. We can help them. The government can address their needs, and the informal settlers can help themselves. Progress can be made at the country's economic margins. Now, let's see the final result of our online polls. Our question is, by giving subsidy, is the government going overboard in assisting informal settlers? All right, the results are yes, 72%, the government is going overboard, and no, 28%. All right, and that's our opposing views for tonight. We'd like to thank our guests, Attorney or Congressman Terry Ridon and Mr. Amado Jake Makasayat. Tune in again next week for another bold and engaging discussion on the most relevant issues of today. I'm Rod Nepomuceno. Good night and God bless.